First of all, I want to talk about, obviously, how I met Roxana. I think I might have told you the story, Jamie, but Roxana, you know, this is a talk for Roxana Ng, in the memory of Roxana Ng.
I don't know Roxana Ng, but...
Roxana was a scholar here at OISE in the 7th floor in adult ed.
Okay.
Very prominent scholar, very well-known feminist scholar. And she's also the first woman of color hired at OISE.
Oh.
So she had a very kind of, you know, she had a very important role here, but she was not remotely, she was a very humble person. And that was what everybody always says about her. And I met Roxana, actually, she was the first person I ever met when I came to OISE. She was my first point of contact, as in she was my advisor. And as a new mother, I came in with my daughter, and she made me feel like so welcome, which is kind of rare in academia, to bring a little crying baby and have somebody make you feel like, oh, this is the right place for you, you belong here. You know, so it was really nice that I had that opportunity. And I also worked in a long-term research project with Roxana. And what's really interesting is that now that when I was preparing for this talk, I was doing a lot of her reading, which I hadn't actually read in such detail before, and I realized how much I had in common with her, more than I knew that I had ideas in common with her, but after reading her articles, I was kind of wishing I had a chance to have a conversation with her about some of these ideas in person. But it's unfortunately not going to happen. But it was like, oh my gosh, all these years, I never had this opportunity with her.
I've been wishing the same thing the last 6 months.
Yeah.
It's really sad that it took her passing away for us to take a look at all of her work and want to talk about
it's
it.
also, I also realized that what part of the reason was she wasn't remotely arrogant about it. She never said to you, oh, you should read this or you should read that. She never ever said that to me. And she knew that I was doing my work on, my work is focused on meditation and spirituality and mothering and South Asian mothering. But she never she always, when I was around her and I would talk about these ideas, I almost felt like I had this fresh new idea. Instead of, she never would say, oh, I've been studying this for so many years. Yeah, I get it. It was always like, she took an interest in my work, which was very, very refreshing, very nice. And I was going to say what that reminded me of is that Shireen Razak, during Roxana's memorial, she used this idea of, she talked about how Roxana had this grace. I don't know if you remember her saying that, Jamie, but she was really, what she was talking about was this idea that she was so, just that she had this very, I can't even really put it into words, but I think really what she was trying to say was how she carried herself as an academic and as somebody who really was in this very prominent role and really kind of like a, I don't want to say pioneer because that's not really the right word, but really played an important role in as a woman of color at OISE in feminist research, and she just had carried this grace with her, which we all felt in the sense of not really, you didn't really know the depth of all of her work sometimes because she didn't kind of push it on you in any way. Okay, so what I want to do was start a discussion about Roxana's ideas about embodied learning and how she tried to integrate them into her life. So what I want to start with a quote from her work. It's called Toward an Embodied Pedagogy, Exploring Health and the Body Through Chinese Medicine. The notion that there is certainty in scientific knowledge, be it in education or medicine, is so ingrained that it's almost impossible to shake this belief, even when people's experiences run contrary to this dominant belief. This shows precisely the hegemonic power of scientific knowledge as it is normally transmitted, and how scientific knowledge becomes normalized and thus hegemonic. It becomes common sense. So when our bodily sensations are rendered irrelevant to the intellectual process, the result is a mind-body split. Within this educational ethos, students learn not to trust their own feelings. And the assumption, and she continues, the assumption is that there's only one way, one version of reality that is truthful and scientific and thus legitimate. So this is kind of like a quote from her work on embodied pedagogy. And so through her work, she sought to bridge this divide between what she thought is legitimate research and work in an academic context. And she taught courses on embodied learning. There's one called on health and illness. There's one on, I believe, it was on embodied learning in Gong as in the last few years. And so what she wanted to introduce students to was how to close this mind-body split within herself, with her students, but also within herself through teaching these classes. And she talks about how she wanted to bring both aspects of her life, her personal philosophy where she was kind of really drawn to Eastern philosophy, Eastern spirituality, and her professional work, which, as I said, was this feminist, women of color feminist doing this really amazing work incorporating critical theory, which some would say has no way to kind of reconcile itself with this idea of embodied learning. That it's two different things. But as she showed, it is possible. And what she wanted to actually show her students was that learning was not a disembodied experience, that it only involved the mind. It involved the whole self, the body, and whatever else was inscribed on that body was also brought into the classroom. So basically, classroom learning was needed to be more than an intellectual exercise, and instead it should lead to a deeper understanding of the self and the self in relationship to others. And also an understanding of, as her students write about, an understanding of how our race, our gender, our class, all those things, all those different aspects of ourselves affect our learning and affect who we are in the classroom. And what was interesting was when she brought these ideas into the classroom, she writes about how she was sometimes met with resistance. And I think at first she said that the resistance was stronger as she kind of worked through that. And the resistance was because her students questioned whether it was real knowledge, whether she was bringing real knowledge, and that was not what basically they weren't expecting to have this kind of holistic understanding. They wanted kind of more regimented, tangible ideas that they could understand versus this idea that, you have to try and understand yourself and nobody can kind of tell you what the answer is. You have to understand yourself in your own way without somebody telling you how to understand yourself. Or as she says, how to feel and what feelings are correct and which feelings are not. But as a paper she co-wrote with her graduate students showed, once they reflected more deeply on the resistance, students were surprised by how much of this mind-body split affected them and their sense of self and their way of being in the world. They discovered that moments of discomfort promote rather than discourage learning. And I thought that was really interesting because this idea that moments of discomfort are where we grow, which is a concept that I've kind of been very familiar with, but it was really, it was great to see how she'd actually, that her and her students, through co-writing this paper together, had also come to this conclusion. A quote from this article, Learning Difference and Embodiment, Personal and Collective Transformations, is, thus for us, the turning point of our learning and transformation came out of discomfort and tension, not familiarity. What is important to underscore is that insight and change occur when we tune in and embrace, rather than resist and reject, those moments of tension and discomfort. So for these students, it was through this embodied learning experience they shared with Roxana, and she also really promoted self-reflection through journaling, small group work, and also their core assignments. But for me, similarly, it was these moments of discomfort and tension that led to my greatest moments of adult learning and transformation. So does anybody have any comments you want to say about some of these ideas of embodied learning that Roxana brought up?
Just very concretely, how is she teaching?
How was she teaching her courses?
Yeah, what would she use, specific techniques or?
You know what she did, which was really interesting, was she would bring meditation and she was a Qigong, I guess, practitioner. Mm-hmm. So she would bring that into the class.
Okay.
So she, as she was talked about, is she struggled with finding readings that would really capture the essence of what she was trying to teach them in terms of embodied learning. So she's always trying to find some really great readings that offered some sort of critical analysis, but also offered kind of a legitimacy for this idea of embodied learning, that this was true knowledge, that this was knowledge that was something that was, could be brought into academic environment. But she talks about it being it was a learning curve for her. Mm-hmm. It wasn't something that just happened or worked the first time she did it. And I think the first time she taught the class where she brought embodied learning in it, the class was on, I believe, equity in the classroom. And something about, it had to do with school, so even in the title of the class had nothing to do with embodied learning. She just tried to integrate it into the class slowly, and especially through ideas such as assignments, such self-reflective journaling. So what I wanted to talk about now was the second idea that I brought up for today's talk was this idea of motherhood and mothering. and how these moments of discomfort and tension that I talked about, and how they promote adult learning and transformation, and how for me this conflict began when I became a stepmother to two young girls, 10 and 12, in a biracial step family. And within this biracial step family, we had huge cultural differences in how to raise our children. I also had 2 more children shortly after becoming a stepmother. So you would think 2 would have been enough, but no, 2 more. And I decided to pursue my graduate studies at the same time with 4, okay? And what was really interesting was, despite my background in feminist studies or even incorporating feminist ideas in my life, I quickly became entrapped in very patriarchal interpretations of motherhood. These ideas that I should be sacrificial, intensive, selfless as a mother, that because I was a woman, as a stepmother, I needed to fulfill some sort of a nurturing or caregiving role with my stepdaughters. I felt a strong sense of duty and obligation based on my South Asian upbringing. And the importance, one of the reasons was the importance given to family life in South Asian culture was so intrinsic to my upbringing and how I was raised, that my identity as a woman was firmly interlinked with that of my family. So I put the needs of the family first, and I put myself last. And I never questioned that. I just fulfilled this role and this kind of very patriarchal idea of motherhood. I knew I had to make changes in my life, but I did not know how. And I wanted to find fulfillment in my role as a mother and in my relationships with my children without the entrapment of expectations that were imposed on me. So mothering scholars such as Adrienne Reach and Andrea O'Reilly, they talk about this through the distinction, through talking about the distinction between motherhood and mothering. They state that motherhood is a patriarchal construction that dictates to women how they should mother, that a good mother should negate her own selfhood to meet the needs of her family, that a good mother should neglect her own needs and be sacrificial and available to the family. So this idea, this idea of what it means to be a good mother, and this puts tremendous pressure on women and mothers to fulfill an impossible ideal. The reason is that the needs, wants, and demands of families are always changing. It is impossible to keep up with them and feel like you're doing a good job. So there's this idea of motherhood is just intense pressure placed on women, and expectations, intense pressure and expectations on how they should be as mothers, which we see in the media all the time. And it's tons of magazines. That what I was blown away by recently is all this stuff about you should have a baby and then you should look like you should have, within a month or 2, you should be looking like this hottie. Like, how is that even physically possible? Like, when you have a newborn baby that you are nursing, how much pressure does that put on a woman to somehow try and fulfill this sexual, idea of them? It blows me away how common that is and how you see that everywhere.
Like the tabloid photographs of Kate Middleton, who were praising her for having the nerve to show her belly after giving birth, right?
Yeah.
Like, it's such a big deal that she looked like a woman who had just had a baby. Oh my God.
Yeah. And also the Kim Kardashian, I know we all hate her, but the thing is, it's still, it was interesting because they were talking about how in the magazine there's like, she's having trouble losing her baby weight. She can't lose her baby weight.
And it's conceptualized as trouble, like it's something that's wrong.
Yeah, like it's a struggle. Meanwhile, her baby's months old. So anyways, that's just one expectation, right? Which is, as far as I'm concerned, a huge expectation on a woman to somehow bounce back after having a baby and somehow be this sexy woman. Or just even the idea that, first of all, you're a mother and you're fulfilling all these roles and you still somehow have to be this ideal sexualized woman, which is almost completely ridiculous as far as I'm concerned. Just the idea that, but also more than that is also just this intense pressure that most mothers, it's just an ongoing societal pressure that it's a woman's job to be the primary caregiver, and because she's a woman, because she's a woman, she has these nurturing qualities. So her partner, if it's a man, can kind of just step back and be like, oh, well, it's your job. You're the woman. You are good at it. And I felt like I said, I fell into that just as much as a lot of women do. And Andrea Riley and Adrian Reach, they talk about this idea of, okay, so you've got this idea of motherhood, which is kind of constructing mother, kind of like a social construction of motherhood. But then which is different from the practice of mothering, which refers to a relationship mother has with her children, and the fulfillment she finds through this act of nurturing that is not imposed upon her. For example, the expectation, just to flesh it out, the expectation is that a mother should spend time with her children every night reading to them. This is, educational. You have to spend quality time with them. That can start to feel very overwhelming very quickly when you need to decompress at the end of a busy day. The expectation that you should do this every day, or the guilt you might feel, or pressure you might feel about how you need to do this every day, it can be really stressful. Whereas the actual act of reading when you are ready to do that as a way to bond with your child can be immensely fulfilling. Because if it is what you want to do and it is what you have time and you are really present with your child, it can be a wonderful way for you to actually spend some time nurturing your child. So there's a distinction between the actual act, the practice of mothering, versus this expectation, which can then almost ruin that time that you have with your children, because the stress of the expectation is greater than the joy you might have found, you know what I mean? Because you weren't ready for it. So Andrea Riley states that through engaged mothering, mothers can reclaim their agency and their selfhood and push back against the demands, pressures, and expectations that motherhood imposes on them. So she talks about this idea of empowered mothering and women kind of trying to nurture their agency, their authority, and mothering from a place of authenticity and giving themselves some autonomy. I know it's all A's, but she talks about how there's a way to kind of push back against these expectations that are placed upon you that affect your relationship with your children, and in fact find more fulfillment in your role as a mother. And so in my quest to engage in a form of empowered mothering, I turned to spirituality. I had been raised with Eastern spirituality. I grew up as a Sikh, and I started a regular spiritual practice and found a spiritual community, or satsanga. This was not an easy path, and there was no instant success, but it's the beginning of my journey to bring my mind, body, spirit together and live more holistically, to relate to the world in an embodied way. So basically, it's kind of like it was a beginning. It was through mothering and stepmothering that started me on my journey to really incorporate some embodied learning into my everyday life, or an embodied way of being in the life, into my life. So when I decided to kind of make this shift, this also had a big impact on my work, because I was actually pursuing my doctoral studies at the time. And part of this journey was choosing to complete my doctoral studies in a way that held meaning for me and enabled me to pursue an embodied form of learning in my work. So this resulted in me turning to creative writing. Through creative writing, I found a way to bring my whole self into my work, not just intellectual self, but also my lived experience, my embodied self. And so for my PhD, I decided to write an autoethnography. But I also, because I wanted to bring my personal life and my life as a graduate student into sync with each other. I want to find a way to bring my whole self into my work, not just intellectual self, but also my lived experience, my embodied self. I didn't realize this when I was doing my PhD, but Roxana also encouraged her students to use their life experiences that were recorded in journals that they did for her class as data. And I was like, oh my God, I had more in common. Like, so she actually was doing this kind of work before it kind of became more well-known. And just, again, shows me another example of Roxana being a trailblazer in her field. And she talked about how the reason she did this is because she wanted her students to legitimize this form of writing that they were doing, and to show that such an account could constitute more than self-absorbed autobiography. So basically, as women writing about our life experiences, it was totally valid to bring that into a research paper we did for an academic class. As Robert Atkinson outlines, self-reflection enhances and expands our experience. It can add greater meaning to the experience we already have. The more we reflect on what has happened or how we feel, the clearer it all becomes. So through writing, I was able to give voice to my experience while simultaneously gaining deeper insight into myself. So before we start our next portion, which is going to be more interactive, which is what I'm hoping to, hopefully people will participate, what I wanted to know was, is there any questions?
Do you think, how do you think the role of extended family or lack of extended family fits into this ridiculous ideal around motherhood that we have, like where you have to be so perfect? And
Yeah. You know, for some people, their extended family makes it worse, right? And for some people, their extended family can be there to actually be a source of support to kind of help them because they know how hard it is, you know? And I feel like a lot of it also depends on so much depends on your family context. So I don't really have a real answer because I feel like it's so specific to because I've heard, because I write for this blog called Masala Mamas. And what's really interesting is that in that blog, there's people writing about, their relationship with their in-laws and, again, these cultural expectations, things that they're supposed to do, and they're running around and after work and they have to drive 2 hours across town to go to an event. And for some of them, the extended family and the expectations being placed on them, that was just, that was part of the reason why they were kind of killing themselves trying to do all this stuff, because they wanted to, be a good mother and be a good role model or be a good daughter-in-law, right? But whereas, and it was interesting because some other women, it's the opposite in the sense that they have one of them, there's a woman with a disabled child, and her extended family is the most supportive people she could ever have in her life, and they take care of her baby, and so she can work full time and she doesn't have to worry about all these things. So it's and when her family has get-togethers, everything's taken into consideration. Her daughter's needs are taken into consideration. So it's very, it just depends on context.
I'd just like to just add maybe a personal reflection. So this ideology of intensive mothering, so these expectations of motherhood, I think they are much stronger in a North American context. So coming from Europe, I had the feeling, so I have a 3.5 years old daughter, and since I arrived here, I have the feeling when I'm in public, I'm performing Canadian motherhood.
Right.
So I've been made to feel not so good, not guilty, but somehow I could have done more, for small things, bringing some special object to the daycare, or accompanying a field trip with the daycare when I'm supposed to work. So should I have taken a day off my important work to just go with the kids on the daycare, and these type of things.
Yeah.
So it's really less intensive I wouldn't generalize for all countries in Europe, but coming from a Francophone background, though I'm not from France, I would say there is less pressure on mothers. Pressures are different. So, for example, you're expected to be a mother and to be a wife and to have a career, because your children will go to school when they are 2.5 years old.
Okay.
And daycares are affordable. And there's a pressure, for example, to stop breastfeeding. So you shouldn't breastfeed for too long in France. And in fact, less than 25% of babies are still breastfed at 1 month old.
At 1 month old?
Yes. Initiation rate is 70%. And so this means that 30% of all babies born in France, so these statistics come from a 2012 studies, were never ever breastfed, not even try. So then 70% of women try to breastfeed, and the rate then drops fairly quickly. Right. And so it's very uncommon to have a 6-month-old baby still breastfed. And there's a pressure for you to stop breastfeeding, and you will be a bad mother if you don't try, but you should stop quickly enough. Also because you have to regain your body and your female shape in some sense.
Right.
But again, it's not for yourself, which would be a good feminist motivation to stop breastfeeding, maybe. Yeah. Maybe, if you feel like regaining your freedom, etc., maybe. But no, it's because your husband must again access your body as a spouse. For some women, that's the motivation. So it's very differently framed. It depends on the context. If you're in North America, I guess if you're in South Asia, with also this context of extended family, which is not like in the next street or in the next city, but maybe right in the same house.
Yes.
You have different expectations. So I very much relate what you say, but again, it's very North American.
Yes.
And just look at other countries, even just Europe. It's fairly different, though we are slowly buying into it again.
Yeah.
So we were taking on this ideology of intensive mothering, but to a lesser extent than here.
That's good to know, though. At least that, I mean,
especially in France, it is not. It's like the fear of the over-attached mother rather than the helicopter parenting style. It's very much criticized, in fact. So again, you have this what I think Adrian Rich said. You have these three things you should do to the child, like nurture, preserve, and make the child socially acceptable. But the ways are vastly different depending whether you are in Switzerland or in Canada.
Yeah.
And there are things which I would do in Switzerland which I would not do here in Canada.
Yeah.
And things that I do here that I let my daughter do, which I would never allow her to do if we were in Switzerland.
You know what's really interesting? My friend just spent a year in France. And she said in France her daughters used to walk to school every day.
Yeah.
And I had another friend who also spent a year in Germany, and she said the same thing. Her two sons used to walk to school every day. Plus they used to go to the park by themselves. And she said it was so common where they were in the town, I can't remember which town they were in, for kids to be on the streets, free, back like how we used to be in the 70s or something. And that her children they felt a lot of freedom there.
Yeah.
And they were probably about maybe 10 and 12, 10 and 13, or 9 and 13, around that age. But then when they came back to Canada, they felt really constricted and confined by what they felt like their whole experience of childhood changed when they came back here. And she said that they missed the freedom that they had when they were in Europe, right? And it was interesting. It's interesting how that this idea of that, like you were saying, this intensive mothering, this idea of helicopter mothering, what that means here, what that translates into here, and what that translates into in terms of expectations for women here versus what you might experience in Europe or what you might experience in South Asia, which, again, as I wrote in my other book, South Asian Mothering book, that's another whole world of experience, right? So what I wanted to do now was, okay, so first of all, are people are willing to be actively engaged in embodied learning? So what I was going to do was, I was going to do a short reading from my book. It's just like maybe for less than 10 minutes. But then I had some quotes that I pulled out, and what I thought would be nice would be to kind of, for people to just spend, like I'll do my reading and we'll kind of hopefully get into a bit of a mood with that, just in terms of some creative writing. And I wanted to pass out these postcards and then have people write, just without thinking about it too much, just write whatever comes to mind based on what's on here, and then hopefully people would be willing to share. Okay? Sound like a plan? So we're going to experience embodied learning through writing instead of just talking about what embodied learning is.
And I also wanted to find out if you have planned. It would be nice to learn about your thesis, your experience of autoethnography. That's what you did, and just it would be nice to hear more about it.
Oh, about my process of writing?
Yes, and how you felt. How long did it take for you to complete it? Just the whole lot. I'd like to find out more and more. I started reading your thesis, and then I don't know, there was something that I just left in the middle. I couldn't complete it. So I'd like to find out more about it.
Okay, well, should we talk about that now, or do you want to talk about it after the exercises?
Let's do some
exercises, and I can talk to you for sure. It was a process for sure, and it would be interesting to share it with you for sure. So my thesis, so this is my PhD dissertation, but minus the academic stuff. I took all the academic stuff out, but it got published basically got published as a memoir, which is interesting.
And what's it called?
It's called Stepmothering: A Spiritual Journey. So I'm going to read a short piece which kind of exemplifies this idea of how discomfort and tension, and how that propelled my or instigated or propelled, I don't know what you want to say, my transformation. But I'm not going to read it till the end, but I'm just going to give you a little snippet. This chapter is called The Fires of Transformation. I'm going to start with a quote from Mangalam Shamanti. When our tendency to blame circumstances, people, and other imaginary sources of pain reaches its height and we are completely frustrated, we are finally forced to turn within. When suffering reaches its extreme, we turn upon our inner psyche to discover that the source of our pain is self-created. At this point, we are ready to learn, to inquire, to explore ourselves sincerely, and become capable of self-reflection and self-transcendence. Then we determine our destiny, and we create the world we wish to live in from the inside out. My throat is parched and burning. My head throbs. I am emotionally exhausted. A tsunami of anger welled up in me, and once it started, I couldn't hold it back. I look up at my stepdaughter, who has stood in the same spot for over an hour, blank-faced, not even flinching. She is like a rock, hard, rigid, and impossible to move. My neighbor appears in my doorway. He looks disgusted. Can you please keep your voices down? I don't like all this yelling. Yeah, sure, sorry about that. I want to tell him that I'm finished being angry, that I'm not usually like this, but I was pushed to the limits of my patience and understanding. But instead, I shut the door and head upstairs. There's nothing left for me to say to my stepdaughter. I check on my children. They are huddled together under the blankets on my son's bed. I hold them tightly in my arms and kiss their soft cheeks. I don't want to grow up, Mommy. I don't want to be a teenager. I'm speechless. I stroke their soft hair. I hate the person I become when I react to my stepdaughter, and I am perplexed as to how to change my behavior. With my limitations, it feels impossible for me to give her my love, even though she's at a time in her life when she needs it most. I hold my children tighter and find solace in their responsive hugs and kisses. When I acted out as a teenager, my parents did not know what to do with me. In their hometowns, nestled in the lush green flatlands of Punjab, teenagers from respectable families did not behave in self-destructive or unpredictable ways. They were too busy studying for college entrance exams and maintaining their reputations for future marriage prospects. In my parents' generation, young people relied on older family members to help them make decisions about their lives. The dreams of their parents, grandparents, and extended family paved the road that they followed. This was especially directed towards the girls, for whom there was great pressure to uphold the honor of the family. Staying out late, dating, experimenting with drugs and alcohol, the defining characteristics of many North American teens, was unheard of for them. This made me an anomaly in my family, but just another kid in my peer group. Part of my confusion stemmed from experiencing racism outside the home, yet feeling suffocated by my family's cultural expectations inside the home. I felt isolated, torn, and guilty at times, but my friends swayed me away from my parents and their values with the lure of thrills and late-night adventures. I thought I understood this teenage angst when my stepdaughters faced similar problems, but my anger often got in the way of my understanding. Instead of having compassion and remembering how hard this period of time was in my own life, I wanted obedience. My relationship with my husband dwindled into one long argument with no beginning or end. I wanted him to parent in a way that I knew and understood according to my culture. He wanted to follow his instincts about what his daughters needed. My husband was not afraid of the chaos associated with adolescence. He was raised in an environment where nonconformity and the questioning of authority was commonplace. The early part of his life was spent living communally in a rural Saskatchewan amongst expansive wheat fields under an enormous blue sky. His mother dropped out of society with a group of young, idealistic friends, creating an anti-establishment haven where free love prevailed. The experiment fell apart when he was school-age and his mother raised him and his sister on her own, at times living communally with other women. By the time he was a teenager, he had experienced generous amounts of freedom and independence. He had the life skills to tend to his own needs and the maturity to take care of his newborn daughter at the age of 16. When my stepdaughters entered adolescence, my husband focused on maintaining his relationships with them. He worried about them, but he showed them his respect. Anger festered inside me when I heard him speaking calmly to them, when they came home hours after the curfew or brought home a failing report card. I became really upset if their surliness was directed towards the younger children. I caused myself much anguish trying to change them, just as I had when they were younger, but this time it was so much worse. Their wills were strong and they had no interest in appeasing me. Before long, I had a ball of anxiety firmly wedged in my gut. Home no longer provided consolation after a long day, and I dreaded the weekends because struggles over curfews were the most intense. My husband could see embers of hostility flickering in my eyes and avoided engaging me in conversation. As circumstances grew increasingly difficult, I struggled to find the inner peace and guidance I'd cultivated through my spiritual practice. It seemed to come so naturally when life was less challenging. When the situation became unbearable, I sought to understand the source of my anger and leaned on my satsanga, my spiritual community, to help me find meaning. The sun warms my shoulders, and I watch the waves crash on the shore. The smell and sound of the water soothes me. The tension in my head eases as the wind blows off the water and brushes against me. I want to enjoy this moment with my husband and children, but instead, he and I return to the same old argument about my younger stepdaughter. So, what are you going to do about it? I demand to know. Nothing, he says. What do you mean, nothing? There's nothing I can do. So you're saying that we just have to sit back and watch while she does God knows what and forgive her every time? Yes, he says. Why? Because we're parents, we're the adults, and we have to do that for her. The tension in my head returns. I'm so tired of being angry all the time. I get up and start to walk along the beach, hoping to find some relief from my frustration. The words of my spiritual teacher, Mangala Anshmati, drift into my heart. Love is a powerful force, honest, respectful, and compelling, whereas physical or psychological manipulation and control are damaging and ineffective. If we hope to guide our children in every moment, we need to steer them by the gentle hand of love. So that's what I'm going to do for my reading.
You mentioned that since you couldn't change the situation, you couldn't afford the situation, so you had to learn to change yourself. And you mentioned spirituality also, so it would be nice if you could talk a bit about how you used your spirituality to embody your learning to change and not leave the situation.
Well, the main thing, I have to say, I was so lucky in life because, first of all, I grew up with a spirituality, Sikh spirituality, a Sikhism. And so I grew up with a sense of spirituality from the time I was a little baby. But I, kind of rejected and rebelled when I was a teenager. But when I became a mother, my sisters and my parents had all kind of almost revived their sense of spirituality. My parents were part of a spiritual community, and they were fine. And my dad had a lot of health problems. He had quadruple bypass, so heart surgery. And he found that through meditation and through all these techniques that he was feeling so much better. And so they kept on telling us when I was in my 20s now, my parents have kind of kept on encouraging us. And so when I was like in this kind of like very difficult situation and I didn't really know where to turn or where it would go, I was guided by my family actually to turn towards spirituality. And I was guided on, the benefits of meditation. And that actually brought me back to where I feel like I almost reclaimed my spirituality that I already had inside me. And if I didn't have that guidance at that time in my life, I'm not sure which direction it would have gone in. Who's to say where it would have gone for me at that point? But I was guided in that direction, and also I myself felt the benefits. I would go to spend time with my satsanga, my spiritual community, and I intensely felt the benefits myself of meditation, deep meditation, not just a sense of mindfulness, but going into kind of deep meditation with a spiritual community. And that in turn, I noticed results. I noticed things change. And really what it was, the biggest change was being less split, right? Feeling more embodied. And when you feel more embodied and you don't feel like you're torn as a person, all of a sudden everything seems more, your whole life seems to unfold in a, kind of seamless way, right? So I was very lucky that way, I have to say, that I was introduced to these ideas. So what I'm going to say now is just to be mindful of the time. If anybody has to leave, it's around 1:30. I understand if anybody has to go, it's totally okay. If anybody wants to stay, we can still continue a discussion because I know you had a couple of questions to ask about my writing process, which I'd love to talk about. So thank you for coming, first of all, to everybody here. So for my writing process, it was really interesting because when I started my MA, I wrote a very traditional MA. Very, very by the book. It's collecting dust in the library. In fact, it might not even be there. It might be in the basement in a vault now. That was back when you bound it, right? You didn't have an electronic copy. But it was a very traditionally written MA in the sense of my style, And for my PhD, because everything I was talking about, this whole process of change I was going through around the second year of my PhD. And I really wanted to do something differently. I really wanted to write something that really was personal and had meaning for me, and it wasn't just something that, again, was going to end up on a shelf. So what I actually did was I took a whole bunch of creative writing classes. So I really kind of trying to shift my whole mindset towards writing. And I took maybe about five creative writing classes, and then I found a teacher who's really awesome, anybody who wants me to recommend her.
What level of creative writing? Was this like continuing education or actual?
I took one continuing ed class at U of T, which I wouldn't recommend, and then 2 with a woman that was around the neighborhood. She has her own kind of writing practice, which was okay, and then a couple with a woman. Her name's Chris Fraser. She's an OISE grad actually, but she has a writing business basically. She teaches creative writing, and her classes were absolutely phenomenal because she just created that space where I felt like I could write about anything and nobody was going to, it was like this very kind of non-judgmental way. Also, I feel like if I'm going to look back on it, I felt like that was probably one of the first times I actually started writing in a very embodied way instead of an intellectual way. Do you know what I mean? Where my writing went out of my head and I was writing from my heart. Was through her classes. She just created that space where you could go there, and so when I was starting to write my thesis, I was trying to think about these themes and these ideas, and I worked with Gary and Ardra on arts informed research, and all they ever used to say to me was to just trust the process, and because I always thought that there's some magic formula that all of a sudden you're just going to know. And there was he was just like, you just have to trust the process. It's gonna take time, and when it happens, it happens. All of a sudden, ideas will start to emerge. And nobody can tell you when that's gonna happen. So it's very vague, very ambiguous. And I just did a lot of writing. Actually, what I used to do was I started writing every single day. I spent there was this one summer that I spent writing every day. And then by the end of the summer, I had this big stack of paper like this, and I had no idea what on earth to do with it. And what my advisor recommended was, he's like, why don't you go through these for themes? What are the themes that keep coming up? And actually, it was very interesting for me, was that all of the 7 themes that are the 7 chapters of my thesis came through that writing process. So after a month of writing, and then taking that writing and literally categorizing it into themes, there were 7 themes that were reoccurring constantly that were ideas that I was always writing about. And once I had the themes, everything just fell into place. Once I knew the topics that I was going to be writing about, actually what I was trying to do was focus on memories that were kind of defining moments, or what Norman Denzin talks about this as epiphanies. So when we're writing, Norman Denzin talks about this idea of epiphanies. So when we're doing creative writing, or when you're doing autobiographical writing, which is kind of is, and also it's also called autoethnography, right? Carolyn Ellis, Art Boschner talk about autoethnography. So they talk about focusing on these defining moments or pivotal moments. And so you're not just writing about anything and everything. You're talking about those moments that held some sort of meaning or some sort of emotion, because the whole point of autoethnography is to engage with the reader in an emotional way. That's what defines it from other types of writing. And so what scholars say is, with autoethnography, the learning occurs through the transaction that happens between, say, me reading and you listening, or you reading my work written in my voice. How you interpret that writing and how you relate that to your own life, that's where the learning is happening. That's where that transaction is happening, and that's where that writing now has meaning, versus just being something kind of that I'm just writing for myself. I'm now writing for other people to also transact with it and also attain greater meaning and depth on their own experiences and their own life. So that was kind of what I guess you could say that's kind of what my intention was on doing this kind of writing. I was just very inspired by other scholars that were doing this kind of work, and I really wanted to kind of push myself. And it was very interesting, though. My advisor actually said to me that he said, if you don't want to do some sort of project that's going to be kind of outside the box, then you should go work with somebody else. So then I was like, okay, interesting. And I wasn't sure I was ready at that point to do something outside the box. And then it kind of gave me a bit of a, I kind of, let's put it this way, I was scared to do something that was non-traditional academic, but at the same time, I really wanted to do it. So there, that was my story. That was what got me there. That's what got me to this place where I actually produce this kind of work.
It's a deep reflection, no?
Yeah. I mean, it was such a big change that I was having this, it was such a big change in the sense that if I'd continued on the trajectory I was doing for my MA, I would have been, just propelled forward by the work I was already doing. Whereas for my PhD, I just kind of cut, nothing from my MA had really relevance. That's not true. Of course, my critical analysis, critical theory, of course, has relevance. But other than that, the work was very different. So I was almost reinventing myself in a way in my PhD, second year of my PhD, which is, basically creating a lot more work for myself than if I just continued on the trajectory I was already on.
So how do you develop writing about yourself? The very important point that you made was the write about yourself, but make it relevant for others, so it becomes interesting for them.
You know what, Arthur Cole actually gave me this advice in a class, and I thought it was really interesting. She said there's writing that we do for ourselves, and then there's writing that we do that we want to present to the public. So it's basically, I wrote another whole book that no one's ever seen. I must have written at least 200 pages, over 200 pages that no one will ever see, because it was really self-absorbed writing, and it was the intention. It was really the tone. There's one thing when you're writing, honestly, like when we're writing for ourselves, often it's this kind of like, this poor me kind of thing, like, oh, this happened to me, someone did this to me. You know what I mean? We kind of have a tendency to kind of go there. But then when we are writing in a way that we hope it to have meaning for others, then there has to be some message in there that's going to have, there has to be something that somebody else is going to get out of it. It can't just be this kind of inward focused me stuff. Do you know what I'm trying to say? And that was the first couple hundred pages I read was all me. And then it was just, again, very subtle, really good advice I got from my advisor about how to shift the tone, just that the writing, like at that point, my writing was good, except the tone needed to be shifted. And so, and the other thing about writing is when we're writing about our own lives, is making sure we're very respectful of all the people in our life, because when we're writing about our life and people read it, anybody in our life is going to feel affected by it. Although I don't mention my stepdaughters' names in there. I don't mention my parents. I don't mention my sister's names. But you can just imagine when I'm talking about my family, I'm talking about all these people. So all these people, when they read your work, and Carolyn Ellis talks about this, because she made the mistake of writing a book. It was like an autoethnography kind of book. And she assumed that the people would never read it. She went into this small fishing community. She wrote this whole book. In fact, I think she won awards for this book. I think it helped launch her career in some ways. And then she went back to the fishing community, and people had read the book. And they were appalled by how she had portrayed them. She thought she did a good job, but meanwhile she had portrayed them as being, very simplistic and, drinkers and, this kind of like, she made various remarks about them, and I think that they shunned her. I think it was so bad that the community shunned her. I'm not sure, I don't know what happened, like if she resolved that or not. But she said that the reaction was, they were just appalled. People were very, very, very angry. And so her thing, on reflection of that experience and what she talks about, is always write, anything you write that's going to be public, assume that the people that are involved in that writing, who are the closest to you, are going to read that. And are you being respectful of that? Like, am I writing about my experience in a way that's respectful for other people? Versus writing about my experience and then, kind of blaming other people in my writing. You see that. You see that a lot in these kind of memoir tell-all kind of books.
So in anthropology, though anthropologists are more aware of this maybe now, nowadays, but that's...
Part of this writing did come from anthropology from Ruth Behar.
Yeah. Writing
vulnerable, what's that awesome piece of hers? Vulnerable writing and... she talks about, oh my gosh, I cannot believe I don't know that quote. That's my favorite quote. She talks about how writing vulnerably is harder to do than writing in an academic kind of way. It's harder to write in that way, but she also talks about how she writes vulnerably because of the depth because of its depth, that she'd rather write vulnerably and put herself out there and put herself in her work. And she was actually an anthropologist, or a cultural anthropologist.
She's still an anthropologist.
Yeah, she was still, yeah.
As far as I know.
But I remember being very influenced by her. There's just one article she wrote, I can't remember it, but I just remember being very influenced by it.
She's beautiful. She
Yeah.
has beautiful writing.
She's beautiful writing, yeah.
At a conference, quite once, she was there. Another thing that the anthropologists are doing now with ethnographers, they became aware of this, a long time ago, but some of the ones who use the arts are very aware of it, that once you walk in a community, you're a part of a creative thing. Like, you're actually changing things the minute you enter.
Yeah.
And so you might as well just integrate that in right from the beginning. And she uses films.
Yeah.
And I think I brought one of her books here once for a presentation, and she talks about changing spaces, because that's of real interest to me. And the minute you do that, you have to watch what your tools, your writing, your films, your visuals, your art, your anything that you do, your discussions, immediately. So get ready, because you're not going to go away with a perfect picture, and you're not going to go away without disturbing what's going on, without entering into something not disturbing. But now there was something else I was going to say that was interesting. Oh yeah, I know. The woman who was the chair of anthropology, I'm not sure if she still is here, but she's just fabulous. And I met her many, many, many years ago. And what she did was she took, very unusually, a friend of hers passed away, and the friend was doing research on female genital circumcision. And I think in Somalia. And they got a narrative story from a young woman, and posthumously, the professor here published it as a novel.
Oh, wow.
And that was my entrance, to that kind of research. But she did that, oh my gosh, it must be 20 years ago. That's what they had, that's what they did. And you look at it and you go, all the nuances, all the social things, all the economics, and all the strength that this woman had was told in this novel. So I don't know that I'd ever do that, but they managed to do it right smack in the middle of academia, just because they had the material. So, but it was published apart from academia. I mean, it was two academics doing it. But so I don't know, and I don't know how they allow. Like, you're talking about reflective, like your own voice. I don't know how they ever got this woman to speak so strongly and openly about. Maybe reflection is better because you see better from your standpoint as an academic what you're best at. So then you choose a different thing to look at, which in itself may also be stronger, which is what I chose to do. Was not to, to draw where I was strong and invite others to join me, which became practice. Which I think is what you were doing.
Well, which is what what's interesting is now that I've done this work, now I try to bring this also to students in classes that I teach. And it is interesting with what Roxana said about resistance, is that there often is a couple people in this class who will resist this idea of bringing the personal into the classroom. And there's people who will absolutely love it and be like, oh my God, it's life-changing. And then there's a couple of people who just absolutely resist. They don't really think of it as knowledge. They don't think that they should have paid money to come to class where you're talking about self-reflection. So it's an ongoing discussion, definitely.
Just this one question about, you talked about spirituality and meditative practice. Is this something that you'd like to transmit to your children as a mother? And if so, how do you do that?
Well, I've been very lucky because the spiritual community that I've been part of, I've gone on 2 retreats with my children, 2 spiritual retreats that were both 1 week long each. And so they were with us for a week, talking about spirituality, trying to, again, during the retreats, we focus a lot on building a sense of community, talking a lot about spiritual values, but also doing meditation and going on nature walks, and also practicing this idea of ahimsa, which is harmlessness. And it was really what it was. We were really talking, really trying to build caring and trust and love for each other. And because they've now gone on those retreats with me twice, and they know I go to meditation classes. I go almost once a week, and they know I go to like there's full moon meditation sometimes I go to, and sometimes I'll take them to a Gurdwara, which is a Sikh religious place. So it's just that really it's me practicing my spirituality and them knowing that I'm practicing it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not that they always see me meditating, it's not like I'm always sitting there meditating. They know that I do that though. And it also really helps for me, which is that my sister's family and their children they came to the retreat with us. So their cousins they're all on the same page. They can talk to their cousins about these same things because we've all gone on spiritual retreats together. And so that's, because sometimes I wonder about whether or not I'm doing enough, and I feel like, am I really teaching them anything? Like, are they going to remember anything? And then, one thing we learned during a meditation retreat was mindful eating.
Mm-hmm.
And what's really interesting is that every now and then my daughter will just close her eyes while she's eating something.
Mm-hmm.
And she just practices her mindful eating. Like, just every now and then out of the blue, I'll just be like, oh, because she just remembered, like, little things they remember from something they did last year. So, but I feel like in terms of, when you're wanting to nurture spirituality, I feel like really it's just how you live, right? And how you are in the world. How you are with the world, that's exactly how your children are going to be in the world, right?
Yeah.
They can be very similar to us.
Yeah.
So hopefully we're doing a good job. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions?
Well, thank you, Jasjit. It was excellent.
Well, thank you everybody for coming and engaging and
This is great.
participating and